Worthing Pier, West Sussex, 2:30 in the afternoon, 10th of September 1933. Station Officer Edwin Hoad, Worthing Borough Fire Brigade, 12 years in the division, stood at the shore end of the pier and read the smoke coming off the southern pavilion, 400 yards out over the water. He was not reading a burning building the way he would have read one on the high street. There was no street here. There was a timber deck on cast iron piles with the sea underneath it, a domed pier pavilion standing between him and the fire, and a southern pavilion at the far end that had stood, largely unaltered, since 1889. The wind was coming off the channel from the east, and it was pushing the smoke and the flame straight along the deck toward the pavilion he needed to save. He had 12 years of borough fires behind him, shop fronts, a hotel, a warehouse on Teville Road. None of them had taught him what to do about 400 yards of unbroken timber with nothing underneath it but water and no hydrant within reach of the fire. That was the first thing the pier told him, before his crew had even started running out hose. A structure fire on a street corner gave you options: a parallel street to draw from, a neighbor's yard to stand in, brick party walls that might hold a seat back for 20 minutes while you got organized. The pier gave him none of that. Whatever line of attack he was going to run, he was going to run it from one direction only, along a corridor of the same timber the fire was already burning, with the nearest water main more than 500 yards behind him on the promenade. The southern pavilion was already established. What Hoad had to decide, standing at the pier gates with the first appliance pulling up behind him, was not how to save the southern pavilion. It was what he could do, in the time it would take to get a charged line 400 yards out, to stop the fire from taking the rest of the pier with it. He had one Dennis combination appliance on scene and a second on its way from the central station. He had several hundred holidaymakers on the promenade and on the pier itself, in bathing costumes, watching a pall of black smoke go up that would be visible from Selsey Bill to Beachy Head within the half hour. What Hoad knew, in the 2 or 3 minutes before he gave his first order, was that his pump was going to arrive at the fire seat with almost nothing behind it, no hydrant close enough to feed a relay in the time he had, and that whatever held the fire to the southern pavilion in the next 30 minutes was not going to be the appliance at all. The appliance Hoad had on the pier that afternoon was a Dennis motor combination, a pump and a wheeled escape carried on the one chassis, the standard purchase for a borough brigade of Worthing's size in this period, when a separate pump and a separate escape tender were an expense few small brigades could justify. Period Dennis records for combination appliances of this class document pump outputs in the region of 250 to 350 gallons per minute, delivered through a single delivery outlet at the rear of the machine, with the crew seated in the open braidwood style that had barely changed since the horse-drawn era. It was a capable engine for what it was built to do: a shop front, a house fire, a warehouse with a hydrant on the same street. It was not built to solve the problem Worthing Pier presented, which was 400 yards of open timber, with the nearest hydrant more than 500 yards away on the promenade, and no second water source of any kind between the shore and the seat of the fire, except the sea itself, which the pier stood over, and which no appliance of 1933 was rigged to draft from at that range. What the 250 to 350 gallons per minute the Dennis could deliver actually meant, once Hoad had done the arithmetic that every borough officer of this era carried in his head without needing to write it down, was that his crew would need hose enough to relay from the hydrant to the appliance, and from the appliance out along the deck to wherever the seat of the fire had reached by the time they got there. A lay of 1,000 yards or more laid across timber planking that was itself burning at the far end. Before we go further, it helps to understand what an isolated seafront pier represented to a British fire brigade in this period, set against the ordinary street fire the same brigade attended every month. A street fire gave a crew multiple approach routes and, in most towns, a hydrant within 100 or 200 yards in any direction, because water mains had been laid to serve the street grid the building stood on. A pier had been built to serve visitors, not firefighters, and its water infrastructure, where it had any at all, was designed for drinking fountains and lavatories, not 4-inch delivery hose. The pump rating that would have been more than adequate for a Teville Road warehouse was, on the pier, only ever going to be as good as the length of Hoad's crew could physically run out before the fire outran them. That was the calculation standing behind him as the second appliance arrived from the central station and began breaking out its own reel. The Dennis could deliver water. What it could not deliver, on its own, was water at the seat of the fire in the time the seat of the fire was going to give him. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected communities built from timber structures that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What a 500-yard hose relay and 300 holidaymakers tearing up decking planks gave Worthing that the pump alone could not, and what the concrete pier rebuild of 1935 removed from every seaside town that followed it. And if you served in the fire brigade in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you or your family served a seaside brigade, or ever fought a fire with no firebreak and the water a hose relay away, what did you do to buy time before the main line was on? Next time, the Pavilion Great Yarmouth lost to fire twice in 5 years, and what the second fire finally taught British brigades about rebuilding over water. Back at the appliance. While the relay was still being built, the fire was not waiting. It had already consumed the southern pavilion and was moving, pushed by the easterly wind, back along the deck toward the domed pier pavilion, standing between the seat and the shore. Hoad's crew, on foot and still hundreds of yards from getting a charged line anywhere near the fire, faced the specific problem that a pier presented and a street never did. There was no brick wall, no party wall, no gap between buildings to arrest the spread. There was only the decking itself. Continuous planking laid over the iron frame, running the length of the structure with nothing built into it to stop a fire once it started moving along the grain of the boards. What stopped it, in the 30 minutes before Hoad's hose reached the fire at all, was not the fire brigade. It was several hundred holidaymakers, documented at the time as more than 300, many still in their bathing costumes from the beach below, who took up picks and crowbars and began tearing up the pier's decking by hand, ahead of the advancing fire, to open a gap in the timber that the flame could not cross without something to burn across. This is not a detail added for color. It is the documented method by which the domed pier pavilion and the landward half of the structure survived that afternoon, while the southern pavilion did not. A firebreak on a pier could not be built by the brigade in the time available because the brigade's tools were built for extinguishing fire, not for demolishing sound structure fast enough to outrun one. It had to be built by hand, by people who happened to be standing on the promenade, using whatever was to hand, in the specific minutes before the crew had water. Before you can understand why this mattered as much as it did, you need to understand what an isolated timber structure over open water meant for a British fire brigade in this decade, compared with any building on land. On land, distance from the seat of a fire to an adjoining structure was itself a form of protection. A yard, a wall, a road. On a pier, distance meant nothing, because the same continuous material connected every point along the structure to every other point. Hoad had, in his 12 years, attended fires in buildings where the walls did the work of containment for him. Here, the only thing capable of doing that work in the time available was a gap physically opened in the fabric of the structure itself, faster than the fire could close it. That the gap was opened by members of the public with tools that had nothing to do with firefighting and not by his own crew was not a failure of the brigade. It was the specific, documented reality of what a pier fire required that a street fire did not. What did Station Officer Hoad's 12 years in Worthing tell him about the difference between a fire he could stop with water and a fire he could only slow while something else stopped it for him? And what did he do in the minutes before his own line reached the fire, with several hundred civilians already doing the one thing that could actually save the pavilion behind him? While the firebreak was being torn open by hand, a second improvisation was underway at the southern pavilion itself, in the minutes before the fire took it completely. A car was driven out onto the pier deck, a decision that belonged to no fire brigade procedure and to no officer's training, but to whoever on the scene judged that the furniture and fittings inside the pavilion were worth the attempt. A human chain formed between the pavilion doors and the car, passing out what could be carried before the heat made the building impossible to enter, and the loaded car was driven back along the pier to the shore. What Hoad's crew could do, in the time available, was fight the fire itself. What they could not do was also empty a building of its contents while doing so. The chain of holidaymakers did the second job while the brigade did the first, and neither replaced the other. The whole event, from the moment the southern pavilion was first seen to be ablaze to the moment it stood as a charred mass of timber, took approximately 30 minutes. That figure is the single most important number in the entire incident, because it defines exactly what a structure fire on an isolated timber pier gave a fire brigade to work with in 1933. And it is considerably less time than the same building would have given Hoad on land. A Victorian timber pavilion, unsprinkled, standing at the end of a wind-exposed structure with a strong easterly fanning the flame along its full timber frontage, did not burn the way a shop front burned. There was no adjoining brick to slow it, no party wall to hold a seat back while a crew got organized, and, critically, no way for Hoad's own appliance to have a meaningful effect on the seat of the fire within that window, because the relay from the promenade hydrant to the pavilion itself was never going to be complete inside 30 minutes over that distance. This is the fact that the documentary record makes unavoidable, and it is not a comfortable one for a fire brigade history to sit with. The southern pavilion was going to be lost regardless of anything Hoad's crew did, because the appliance physically could not deliver water to the seat of the fire before the pavilion had already burned, to the point where there was nothing left worth defending. What Hoad's crew's presence and the firebreak together achieved was not saving the southern pavilion. It was making certain that the fire went no further than the southern pavilion, that the domed pier pavilion, the amusement arcade, and the landward half of the pier structure were still standing when the smoke cleared. That distinction between a fire a brigade extinguishes and a fire a brigade contains to what is already lost is not a failure. It is the honest description of what a 500-yard hydrant distance and a wind-driven timber fire made possible and made impossible in the same 30 minutes. What did those 30 minutes teach Station Officer Hoad about the difference between arriving at a fire in time to save the building and arriving at a fire in time only to save everything the fire had not yet reached? And what would it mean for how Worthing's brigade, and every seaside brigade like it, thought about piers after that afternoon? Sub-Officer Hoad had not been taught how to fight a pier fire. Nobody in Worthing's Borough Brigade had. The training a small seaside brigade received in this period covered the buildings the town actually had in quantity: the terraced housing, the hotels along the front, the shop fronts, and the occasional warehouse, because that was where the brigade's calls came from, month after month, year after year. A pier was not a recurring risk in the way a hotel chimney fire or a shop's electrical fault was recurring. It was a singular structure, built once, standing at the edge of the town's ordinary geography and the specific knowledge required to manage a fire on it, the water access problem, the firebreak problem. The total absence of party walls was not knowledge that any borough brigade training program of this era had been built to provide, because the building type itself was too rare within any single division to justify training doctrine around it. What filled that gap on the afternoon of 10th of September 1933 was not doctrine. It was improvisation drawn from general principles. Hoad's 12 years had given him a working sense of how fire moved through timber, how wind direction changed what a crew could and could not hold, how quickly an unsprinkled Victorian structure could go from smoke to total involvement, applied, for the first time in his career, to a structure with no walls to contain it, and no water main within reach of it. That combination of general fire behavior knowledge and a building type that offered none of the usual containment features is what every pier fire in this period actually tested. It was not a test of courage. It was a test of whether a brigade's ordinary training could be stretched to cover a structure the training had never been designed around. Worthing's Pier was not the first in Britain to fail that test, and it would not be the last. Great Yarmouth's Britannia Pier had already lost its first pavilion to fire in December 1909 and its second pavilion to fire in April 1914, in an incident local report attributed at the time to suffragette arson, and would lose a further building, the Floral Hall Ballroom, to fire again in August 1932, a year before Worthing burned. Hastings Pier had suffered a serious fire in July 1917. The Grand Pier at Weston-super-Mare had burned in 1930, 3 years before Worthing. Each of these was a different brigade, in a different town, arriving at the same specific problem independently, because there was no shared body of pier fire doctrine circulating between British seaside brigades in this period, the way there was shared doctrine for tenement fires or warehouse fires. Each brigade solved it, to the extent it was solved at all, with the general firefighting knowledge its officers already had, and whatever the public standing nearby happened to be willing to do with their hands. What did the absence of any specific pier fire doctrine tell British seaside brigades over 3 decades and 5 separate incidents from Great Yarmouth to Weston-super-Mare to Worthing about the kind of structure a pleasure pier actually was, and what would it finally take, after Worthing's southern pavilion went up in 30 minutes, for that knowledge to be written down anywhere at all? For the crowd that tore up the decking with their bare hands, the pier was not an abstraction. It was the reason Worthing existed as a resort town at all, in the practical, economic sense that mattered to the shopkeepers, boarding house landladies, and seasonal traders whose entire year's income depended on visitors choosing Worthing over Brighton, Bognor, or Littlehampton for their summer week. The pier was the town's single largest visitor attraction, the destination that justified the railway excursion fares and the boarding house bookings, and its southern pavilion, with its orchestra performances and its 2-penny admission, was one of the specific reasons a family chose to spend an afternoon, and their money, in Worthing rather than along the coast. A crowd that had been sunbathing on the beach an hour earlier did not pick up crowbars because they had been asked to. They did it because a pier fire in a resort town in 1933 was not somebody else's emergency. It was a direct threat to the thing the whole town's summer income was built around, and everyone standing on that promenade understood that without needing to be told. This is the dimension of a pier fire that a purely operational account misses if it stops at the appliance and the hose relay. Worthing Borough Council had bought the pier outright in 1920 for just under £19,000, precisely because the pier was understood by the town's own administration to be civic infrastructure as much as private entertainment. An asset the council itself had a direct financial stake in protecting and had continued to invest in since, replacing the original kiosks with a new 1,000-seat pier pavilion as recently as 1926. A fire on the pier was, in the most direct sense available to 1933 Worthing, a fire in the town's own balance sheet. The holidaymakers who formed the human chain to save furniture, and the crowd that tore up decking to save the rest of the structure, were not simply spectators who happened to be present. They were the pier's customers and the town's residents acting, in the absence of any other tool available to them in that half hour, to protect the specific asset their own livelihoods and their own council's investment depended on. What the fire also exposed, in a way that a shopfront fire never could, was how directly visible a resort town's fortunes were to everyone standing on its own beach. A textile warehouse fire in Manchester was witnessed, in the main, by the people who worked in it and the immediate neighbourhood around it. A pier fire in September, at the height of the late-season holiday trade, was witnessed by every visitor on the beach, every resident on the promenade, and, because the smoke column was visible from Selsey Bill to Beachy Head, a stretch of coastline more than 20 miles across, by people in resort towns along the entire coast who had no direct stake in Worthing at all, but understood exactly what they were looking at, because their own towns had piers built the same way, out of the same timber, standing over the same unreachable water. What did it mean for a fire brigade of this era to be protecting not simply a building, but the specific economic identity of the town it served? And what did the crowd on Worthing's beach understand about that pier, in the half hour it burned, that no fire brigade training manual had ever needed to spell out for them? By the time Worthing's southern pavilion had cooled enough for Hoad's crew to walk out onto the burnt section and assess what remained, the fire had already become something more than a local incident. It became, within days, a documented entry in the specific, unwritten catalogue that every seaside town on the English coast was quietly keeping about its own pier. A catalogue built not from shared training bulletins, but from newspaper reports, from British Pathé newsreels, and from the ordinary conversation between town councils who each owned a structure exposed to exactly the same risk. Great Yarmouth's council had rebuilt its Britannia Pier Pavilion 3 times by 1933, after fires in 1909, 1914 and 1932. Weston-super-Mare's council had watched its Grand Pier burn in 1930. Every one of those councils, and Worthing's alongside them, understood by direct or second-hand experience that a timber pier pavilion was not a permanent structure in the way a stone town hall was permanent. It was a structure that would, with something close to statistical certainty over a long enough span of years, eventually burn, and the only real variable was how much of the pier around it burned with it. That understanding is what made the community response on 10 September 1933 as immediate and as organized as it was. Nobody on Worthing's beach that afternoon needed to be told what a burning pier pavilion meant, because pier fires were, by 1933, a recognizable category of English seaside disaster with its own visual vocabulary. The black smoke over the water, the crowd on the promenade, the frantic effort to save what could be saved before the whole structure went. The response that afternoon was not improvised from nothing. It was improvised from a shared cultural memory of exactly this kind of event happening, with minor variations, up and down the coast for the previous quarter century, even though no fire brigade had ever formally trained for it. What that meant for the firefighter, as opposed to the crowd, was a specific and uncomfortable professional position. Hoad's own training had prepared him for the buildings Worthing actually had many of. It had not prepared him for the one building the town had only one of, and could least afford to lose. Every seaside brigade in Britain in this period occupied that same position with respect to its own pier, a single, irreplaceable structure sitting entirely outside the pattern of buildings the brigade's ordinary training and equipment were designed around, defended in practice not by doctrine but by whatever combination of general skill, available water, and civilian willingness to pick up a crowbar happened to be present on the day the fire came. What did the accumulated record of pier fires along the English coast, 5 incidents and counting by 1933, from Great Yarmouth to Hastings to Weston-super-Mare to Worthing, tell British seaside councils about the specific structure they owned and had never quite finished protecting? And what would it finally take for that lesson to change how a pier was rebuilt rather than simply how it was mourned? The change that mattered most did not come from the fire brigade at all. It came from the rebuilding decision Worthing Borough Council made in the 2 years after the fire, and it is documented plainly enough in the structure that stands at the south end of Worthing Pier today. A new Art Deco pavilion, completed in 1935, replacing the Victorian timber structure that had stood since 1889 and burned in 30 minutes. Worthing was not alone in reaching for a different material after fire had made the old one's limits explicit. Penarth's Pier Pavilion, completed in 1929, had already gone up in reinforced concrete rather than timber at its landward sections. Claremont Pier at Lowestoft would be rebuilt in reinforced concrete after storm damage in 1950. The pattern, across English and Welsh seaside piers through the 1930s and into the post-war period, was consistent. Where a pier had burned, or where a council had the funds to rebuild ahead of a fire rather than after one, timber gave way to concrete and steel at exactly the points where the old material had offered fire nothing to stop it. What concrete changed was not the risk of ignition. A pavilion could still catch fire from a cigarette end, an electrical fault, a stage lighting rig, exactly as timber pavilions always had. What it changed was the thing Hoad's crew had been unable to supply on 10 September 1933, a stopping point built into the structure itself, rather than one that had to be improvised by 300 holidaymakers with picks and crowbars in the 30 minutes a fire allowed them. A concrete pavilion did not need a firebreak torn out of it by hand, because it was not made of the material a firebreak needed to interrupt. The specific operational problem that had defined the Worthing fire, continuous timber with no natural stopping point across 400 yards of structure, was the exact problem the 1935 rebuild was designed not to have again. This is where the story of the pier fire and the story of the firefighters' knowledge finally separate. What Hoad had learned on 10 September 1933, the 500-yard hydrant problem, the impossibility of a hose relay outrunning a wind-driven fire on open timber, the specific value of a civilian firebreak torn out ahead of the flame, was knowledge about how to fight a fire on a Victorian timber pier. It was not knowledge that transferred cleanly to a 1935 concrete and steel Art Deco pavilion, because a concrete pavilion did not burn the way the Southern Pavilion had burned, and did not present the same 500-yard problem to the same degree, because there was less of it capable of sustaining fire in the first place. The rebuild did not make Hoad's knowledge worthless. It made it knowledge about a building type that Worthing's own pier, standing at the same address, no longer entirely was. What did the choice of concrete over timber, repeated at pier after pier along the English and Welsh coast through the 1930s, actually remove from the specific operational problem that Station Officer Hoad had spent 30 minutes solving with nothing but a hose relay and a crowd of strangers? And what happened to that knowledge, once the building it had been built to answer no longer stood in quite the same way? Before the concrete pavilion at Worthing's south end had stood for even 5 full seasons, a different threat reached every pier along the English coast, and it did not come from fire. With the outbreak of the Second World War, seaside piers, projecting as they did from the coastline directly toward the Channel and the North Sea, were assessed by military planners as a potential landing aid for an invading force, and sections of the deck were deliberately removed from piers up and down the coast to break their usefulness as a route from ship to shore. Worthing's pier lost part of its promenade structure in this period, along with dozens of others, Southend, Brighton, Bournemouth, Great Yarmouth among them, each rendered deliberately impassable in the middle by the country that owned them, for reasons that had nothing to do with combustion and everything to do with a possible landing craft. This is worth setting alongside everything Hoad's generation had learned about pier fires, because it is the clearest possible demonstration of how completely a pier's risk profile could change without a single fire occurring. The pier that fire had taught Hoad to fear for its unbroken timber run was, within a decade, deliberately broken by the same kind of authority that had once bought and insured it, for a threat that had nothing to do with flame, wind, or hydrant distance. The specific knowledge Hoad had built about hose relay distances and civilian firebreaks was knowledge about a structure that no longer existed in quite the same continuous form for the duration of the war, because the state itself had done, for military reasons, something functionally similar to what 300 holidaymakers had done with crowbars in 1933, opened a gap in the timber that nothing could cross. After the war, the gaps were closed again, the promenades reinstated, and the piers reopened to the visitors, whose custom the whole apparatus of seaside tourism had always depended on. Worthing's pier, along with most of its counterparts, returned to ordinary service in the years that followed, its Art Deco Southern Pavilion by then over a decade old and never once tested by the kind of fire that had destroyed its predecessor. Whether that was because concrete had genuinely removed the risk, or because Worthing simply had not yet had its next unlucky afternoon, was not a question the town's borough brigade, reorganized, like every English fire brigade, into the new post-war structure that followed the wartime National Fire Service, had any way of answering with certainty. What the brigade could say with certainty was that the specific problem Station Officer Hoad had solved with a hose relay and a stranger's crowbar on 10 September 1933 belonged to a building that the town, by design, by wartime necessity, and finally by choice, had made sure it would not have to solve in quite the same way again. What did the wartime severing of Britain's piers, coming barely 6 years after Worthing's fire, tell the borough brigades that had spent 3 decades building isolated knowledge about their own single pier, and what was left of that knowledge, once the structure it had answered to had been changed twice over, first by fire and then by the demands of a war that had nothing to do with it? Worthing Pier's southern pavilion burned in 30 minutes on the afternoon of 10 September 1933. The pier lost part of its structure again, deliberately, during the Second World War. It was rebuilt in concrete by 1935 and repaired again after the war, and it has stood in that form, broadly, ever since. The last major fire on Worthing Pier itself, belonging to a different century and a different structure than the one that burns today. What the 1935 rebuild gave Worthing: a pavilion that did not depend on a 500-yard hose relay to survive its own ignition, because the material itself no longer offered a fire, the same continuous run of fuel that had let the wind carry flame the length of the southern pavilion in half an hour. What it removed: the specific knowledge Station Officer Hoad had built on that single afternoon. What a wind-driven timber fire over open water actually cost in minutes. What a 500-yard hydrant distance actually meant for a hose relay. What 300 strangers with crowbars could do that no appliance in Worthing's possession could do faster. No training manual had asked for that knowledge before 1933, and no training manual needed it after 1935, because the building that had required it no longer stood. The new pavilion did not produce the fire that had built that knowledge. It did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went with the men who had it. The timber went into the sea when the crowd tore it up to save what was left of the pier. Nobody had asked either of them to leave anything behind. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more piers standing over water with no hydrant within reach, and more 30-minute fires that a crowd of strangers, not a fire brigade, finally decided the outcome of. What a 500-yard hose relay and 300 holidaymakers tearing up decking planks gave Worthing that the pump alone could not. And what the concrete pier rebuild of 1935 removed from every seaside town that followed it. And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a pier, put it in the comments. If you or your family served a seaside brigade, or ever fought a fire with no firebreak and the water a hose relay away, what did you do to buy time before the main line was on? Next time, the Pavilion Great Yarmouth lost to fire twice in 5 years, and what the second fire finally taught British brigades about rebuilding over water. Station Officer Edwin Hoad's account of 10th of September 1933 belongs to a composite drawn from the documented facts of the Worthing Pier fire. The fire itself, the hydrant distance, the human chain, and the 30 minutes are real. What went with the timber went with everyone who stood on that pier that afternoon, brigade and crowd alike, and none of it was ever written down as doctrine anywhere at all.